The tray was set for one. Alaric Staveley, Duke of Kelham, stood in the upstairs corridor of his own house at 6:07 in the morning and understood with a clarity that made the air taste of iron that his wife had outmaneuvered him entirely. The tray sat on the console table outside the blue guest chamber. Silver. Not the household silver kept in daily rotation, but the formal set, the one Rosalind had commissioned from Rundle and Bridge in the first months of their marriage, engraved with the Kelham crest at each corner. A pot of chocolate, still faintly steaming. A covered dish that, when he lifted the lid with fingers he did not recognize as unsteady, revealed coddled eggs and 3 slices of toast cut into precise triangles. A small crystal vase held a single white rose from the cutting garden. And beside the vase, folded once with the crease perfectly aligned, a note in his wife's hand. He did not read it. He did not need to. The blue guest chamber had been opened and aired sometime after midnight. He could smell the beeswax and lavender water that always accompanied Mrs. Yarrow's preparations, and the woman inside it was not a guest in any sense the household would customarily recognize. Lady Joanna Fanshawe had arrived at Kelham Park the previous afternoon, in a barouche with mud-flecked wheels and a hat-box that her maid had carried in through the servants' entrance, while Joanna herself had been shown through the front hall. Rosalind had been in the morning room when the carriage turned into the drive. Alaric knew this because Firth, who missed nothing and said less, had mentioned it in passing while reviewing the week's accounts. She had seen the barouche. She had said nothing. And now, this tray, this immaculate, unhurried, devastating tray. He set the lid back on the dish with exaggerated care, as though the sound of porcelain on porcelain might detonate something, and walked back down the corridor toward his own rooms. His boot heels on the oak floor sounded very loud. Behind him, the tray sat in the gray half-light of early morning, waiting to be carried in by whichever member of staff his wife had instructed, and he understood that he could not intercept it without confirming to the entire household what the tray already announced. She had hosted. That was the word his mind returned to, again and again, as he stood at his dressing-room window and watched the park emerge from mist. She had not wept. She had not confronted. She had not packed her trunk, sent for her father, or shut herself in her rooms with a headache that everyone would have understood. She had gone to the kitchen, or sent Dorcas, or spoken to Mrs. Yarrow, he did not know which, and the not knowing was itself a kind of wound, and she had ordered breakfast prepared for the woman her husband had installed under their shared roof. She had selected the formal silver. She had cut a rose from her own garden. She had written a note. The completeness of it was what stopped his breath. He had been careless. He could admit that now, standing at the window with his cravat untied and his coat still hung over the chair where his valet had left it the night before. He had been careless, not in the way of men who believe their wives will not discover them. Rosalind discovered everything, quietly, the way dawn discovers a landscape, without announcement, but in the way of men who have stopped noticing that a thing can be discovered at all. Joanna's presence at Kelham Park was not an affair conducted in shadows. It was an indifference performed in broad daylight. He had not troubled to conceal her, because he had not troubled to consider the concealment was owed. That was the cruelty of it, and the tray had named it perfectly. Rosalind Deverell had come to him 3 years earlier through an arrangement negotiated by their fathers in the library of her family's house near Taunton. Sir Halbert Deverell was a baronet of modest fortune and excellent reputation. He had 4 daughters and no sons, and the eldest, Rosalind, had been presented in London the previous spring, with results that were respectable but not remarkable. She was not plain. She was not beautiful. She had the kind of face that resolved itself slowly, cheekbones that emerged in certain light, a mouth that changed entirely when she spoke, and the tongue which preferred its beauties to announce themselves from across the room had catalogued her as pleasant and moved on. Alaric had noticed her at a dinner given by the Countess of Bridewell, not because she was seated beside him, but because she was not. She had been placed at the far end of the table, between an elderly clergyman and a young officer who talked only of his regiment, and she had managed both with a composure so seamless that it took him several minutes to recognize it as a performance. She listened. She asked questions that made dull men believe themselves interesting, and when the officer said something genuinely foolish about the harvest, she had looked down at her plate with an expression so briefly, precisely controlled, that Alaric, watching from 20 feet away, had felt a pulse of recognition he could not explain. He had asked Sir Halbert's permission to call. The courtship that followed was conducted in drawing rooms and garden walks, always chaperoned, always correct, and Alaric had found Rosalind to be exactly what he expected: agreeable, intelligent, composed. She played the pianoforte adequately but did not perform at parties. She read widely but did not quote in conversation. She had a way of listening to him that made him feel both heard and slightly studied, as though she were cataloguing not just his words but the spaces between them, and this had flattered him in ways he did not examine. She had accepted his offer with a sentence so carefully composed that he remembered it 3 years later. "I am sensible of the honor, Your Grace, and I accept it with the understanding that I shall endeavor always to be a credit to your house." He had thought it modest. He understood now that it had been a contract, offered in precise terms, and that she had honored every word of it, while he had honored none. The wedding had been held at Taunton in June, in a church with Norman windows and a yew tree in the yard that was older than the Stavely title. Rosalind had worn white muslin with seed pearls at the bodice and a spencer of pale gray silk, and she had spoken her vows in a voice that carried clearly to the last pew. He remembered thinking, as the vicar pronounced them man and wife, that he had made a sensible match. Sensible. The word felt obscene to him now. She had made Kelham Park her study. Within 6 months she knew the tenants by name, their children by age, their grievances by weight. She corresponded with Firth on drainage and planting. She consulted Mrs. Yarrow on every question of household management and deferred to her in matters of staffing, which earned her the housekeeper's loyalty so thoroughly that Mrs. Yarrow, who had served Alaric's mother for 22 years, began keeping a second set of household keys specifically for the Duchess. The gardens, which had been adequate under the previous groundskeeper's supervision, became under Rosalind's oversight something approaching renowned. She understood which people to trust and how to listen to them. The cutting garden behind the south wall, which had been nothing but a square of neglected beds when she arrived, produced within 2 years roses that Lady Greenlaw herself had complimented at the summer assembly. All of this Alaric had observed the way one observes weather, pleasantly, distantly, without the recognition that weather could turn. He had met Joanna Fanshawe at a house party in Berkshire 18 months into his marriage. She was the widow of Sir Marcus Fanshawe, who had left her a house in Half Moon Street and enough income to maintain it. She was handsome, forthright, and entirely without illusion about what she was to him. Their arrangement had been conducted with what Alaric had considered discretion, London only, her house, never at Kelham, until a fortnight ago, when Joanna had written saying she intended to visit friends in the county, and might she call at the park, as she had always wished to see the gardens. He had said yes. He had said yes without hesitation, without consultation, without the briefest acknowledgement that the gardens Joanna wished to see were the gardens his wife had built. He had said yes because it had not occurred to him that there was a question being asked. That was the decision the tray had answered. Rosalind's morning began, as all her mornings began, at 5:30. Dorcas, who had attended her since before the marriage, and knew her moods by the angle of her shoulders, brought washing water and laid out the dove-gray muslin day dress with the embroidered hem that Rosalind wore most mornings when the household was informal. She dressed without conversation. She pinned her hair herself, a simple arrangement, low at the nape, secured with 2 tortoise-shell combs that had been her mother's, and descended the back stairs to the kitchen at 5:45. She had lain awake most of the night. She did not intend anyone to know this. The decision had come to her sometime after 2 in the morning, in the particular clarity that arrives when sleep has been abandoned and the mind, released from the obligation to rest, begins instead to work with a precision it cannot achieve during daylight. She had considered her options the way she considered drainage plans, methodically, without sentiment, evaluating each for its likely outcome. She could confront Alaric, she could leave, she could pretend ignorance, she could weep, which would bring Dorcas and then Mrs. Yarrow and then the whole household into an awareness that would make the situation unmanageable. She could write to her father, who would arrive within 3 days and whose presence would force a resolution that would satisfy no one and humiliate everyone. Or she could send a breakfast tray. The idea had arrived fully formed, like a chess move that reveals itself only when every other possibility has been exhausted. She would not confront the woman in her house. She would serve her. She would do it with the formal silver and a white rose and a note written in her own hand, and she would make the act so flawlessly correct that no one, not Alaric, not Joanna, not any member of the household staff, could find in it a single thing to criticize. She would fulfill her duties as hostess with such perfection that the perfection itself would become the indictment. Mrs. Yarrow was already in the kitchen when Rosalind descended. She was always already there. The housekeeper operated on a schedule that seemed to predate the household itself, and she looked up from the morning's bread order with an expression that told Rosalind everything she needed to know about whether the blue guest chamber had been observed. "Mrs. Yarrow," Rosalind said, "I should like a breakfast tray prepared for the guest in the blue room. The formal silver, if you please. Chocolate, coddled eggs and toast, and a white rose from the cutting garden. Dorcas will know which." Mrs. Yarrow set down her pen. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In it, the kitchen fire crackled, and somewhere beyond the scullery door, a housemaid was filling a basin. Mrs. Yarrow's face underwent a series of adjustments so subtle that only someone who had spent 3 years learning her expressions could have catalogued them. Surprise, comprehension, something very close to grief. And then, settling over all of it like a dustcloth laid over furniture in a closed room, professional composure. "Yes, Your Grace. The note I shall write myself. Have Jessup carry the tray up at 6:15. He is to knock once, leave it on the console, and withdraw." "Yes, Your Grace." Rosalind turned to go. At the door she paused, not for effect, but because the thing she wished to say next required a particular kind of steadiness. "The tray is to be perfect, Mrs. Yarrow. I want nothing about it that could be mistaken for haste or spite or carelessness. It is a breakfast tray for a guest in this house, and this house does not serve its guests poorly." Mrs. Yarrow looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "It will be exactly as you say, Your Grace." "Thank you, Mrs. Yarrow." The housekeeper watched the Duchess leave the kitchen. She stood motionless for several seconds after the door closed. Then she turned to the cook, who had been pretending not to listen from the far side of the range, and said in a voice that permitted no discussion, "The Rundell silver, the large tray, the good chocolate, not the household pot, and do not ask me why." Rosalind went to the morning room. She sat at the small writing desk by the window, the one that caught the earliest light, where she composed her household correspondence each day, and wrote a note on her personal stationery, the creamstock with the Kelham crest pressed in blind at the top. The note read, "I trust you slept well. The gardens are at their best before noon, should you wish to walk. Do ring if you require anything further. R. Stavely." She folded it once. She did not blot it because her hand had been perfectly steady, and there was nothing to blot. She placed it on the salver Dorcas had brought to the hall table, beside the rose, a single maiden's blush, pale and tight-petaled, cut that morning while the dew was still on it, and she went back to the morning room to wait. Jessup, the first footman, carried the tray upstairs at the appointed time. He was 23, well-trained, and understood from the particular quality of Mrs. Yarrow's instructions that this errand was not to be discussed with the other staff. He knocked once, set the tray on the console table outside the blue guest chamber, and withdrew. He did not see the Duke standing at the far end of the corridor, and the Duke did not make himself known. The house moved through its morning. Rosalind took her own breakfast in the small dining room at 7:30, as she always did. Tea, toast, a boiled egg. She read the previous day's correspondence, a letter from her sister Philippa regarding a christening in Dorset, a note from Firth about the South Meadow drainage, an invitation from Lady Greenlaw to a card party the following Thursday, and made annotations in the margin with a pencil she kept beside her plate. When the tea cooled, she poured a fresh cup. She spread marmalade on her second slice of toast with the same attention she gave to every small task, as though the act of breakfasting were itself a kind of argument, that she was here, that she had always been here, that she intended to continue being here long after the blue guest chamber had been stripped and the barouche had disappeared down the drive. She did not look up when the sound of a carriage being brought around reached her through the open window. The barouche left at 8:20. Rosalind knew this because she heard the wheels on the gravel, and because Dorcas, who had positioned herself at the landing window with a duster she did not use, reported it later with the briefest possible inclination of her head. Lady Fanshaw's maid had packed the hat box. The blue guest chamber was being stripped and aired before 9. The sheets were sent to the laundry. The white rose, which had not been taken from the tray, was removed by a housemaid who did not know what it signified and placed in a glass of water in the servants' hall, where it lasted 3 more days. Rosalind did not watch the carriage leave. She finished her egg. Alaric came to the breakfast room at 8:45. He had dressed with more care than usual. Rosalind noticed these things, catalogued them in the quiet ledger she kept behind her expression, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, which he had never done before. He always entered rooms as though they had been waiting for him. Today, he entered as though the room might contain something he was not prepared to meet. "Good morning," Rosalind said. She did not look up from Philippa's letter. "Good morning." He sat. He poured his coffee from the pot that had been left for him, added no sugar, though he usually took 1 spoon, and drank it in 2 swallows as though it were medicine. The silence between them had a texture it had never previously possessed, not hostile, not cold, but architectural, load-bearing, the kind of silence that, if either of them disturbed it carelessly, might bring down things that could not be rebuilt. "Lady Fanshawe has departed," he said. His voice was controlled, but Rosalind heard the fracture in it, not a crack precisely, but a place where the surface had been tested and found thinner than expected. "I trust she found the house comfortable." Another silence. Alaric lifted his coffee cup and set it down without drinking. "The breakfast tray," he said. "Yes?" "You ordered it." "I order all breakfast trays in this house, Your Grace. It is among my duties." The precision of it, the way she folded his own domestic authority back upon him, the way she made the tray simultaneously an act of wifely competence and an indictment so complete that he could not object to it without objecting to her fulfillment of the very role he had assigned her, landed in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. He felt the rings of it spreading outward through every room of the house, through the kitchen where the cook was already washing the Rundle silver, through the servants' hall where Jessup was polishing boots and not meeting anyone's eyes, through the blue guest chamber where a housemaid was turning the mattress and opening the windows to let the last trace of Lady Fanshaw's perfume dissipate into the morning air. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He understood, perhaps for the first time since the morning he had found the tray in the corridor, that there was nothing he could say that she had not already anticipated. She had constructed a situation in which every possible response from him, anger, denial, apology, deflection, confirmed the thing she had not said. She had given him no accusation to refute, no tears to comfort, no ultimatum to negotiate. She had given him a perfectly prepared breakfast tray on formal silver with a white rose and a courteous note, and she had made it the most devastating thing anyone had ever done to him. "Rosalind, more tea, Your Grace." She lifted the pot. Her hand was steady. Her face was exactly the face she wore every morning, pleasant, composed, attending to the small machinery of domestic life. And it was this, finally, that told him the scale of what he had done, not to the marriage, to her. She had absorbed the insult of another woman sleeping under her roof, and she had transmuted it into something so elegant, so utterly beyond his capacity to answer, that he was sitting in his own breakfast room, feeling like a man on trial in a court whose rules he had never learned. "No," he said. "Thank you." He did not finish his coffee. He excused himself and went to his study, where he sat for 40 minutes without reading a single document on his desk. The quarterly accounts from Firth lay open at the page where he had left them the previous evening. The ink had dried on his pen. Through the window he could hear the gardeners beginning their work in the beds below the terrace. One of them was whistling. The sound was obscenely cheerful. He thought about the note on the tray. He had not read it, but he could imagine its contents. Some small courtesy, some perfectly calibrated pleasantry, written in Rosalind's clear hand on the cream stationery she used for all household correspondence. The same hand that wrote to tenants about roof repairs and to her sisters about christenings had written a note of welcome to the woman who had slept in her house at her husband's invitation, and it would have been flawless. Rosalind did not do things by halves. She had spent 3 years learning this house, and she had used every piece of that knowledge to construct a single gesture so complete that it contained within it everything she would never say aloud. In the days that followed, the household observed a shift that was difficult to name and impossible to ignore. The Duchess continued her duties without alteration. She met with Firth about the quarterly rents and the drainage extension for the lower pasture. She reviewed the kitchen accounts with Mrs. Yarrow. She attended the parish church on Sunday and sat in the Kelham pew and sang the hymns and spoke afterward with the vicar's wife about the new almshouse subscription, pledging £20 from the household fund and promising to send Mrs. Yarrow to assess what linens might be spared. She did everything she had always done in exactly the manner she had always done it, and the fact that nothing had changed was itself the change. The staff felt it first. Mrs. Yarrow said nothing to anyone, but her silence on the matter was itself a communication that the senior staff understood. Jessup, who had carried the tray, developed a habit of standing a little straighter when the Duchess passed and anticipating her requests before she voiced them. The cook began preparing Rosalind's preferred breakfast, the eggs done to precisely 4 minutes, the toast cut thinner than the Duke's, with an attention that bordered on devotion. The household had taken a side without anyone declaring there were sides to take. Alaric began, not immediately, not with any single dramatic gesture that the household could point to and say there, that was the moment, to rearrange his life around his wife's coordinates. He cancelled a planned trip to London. He wrote to his solicitor postponing a matter that had no urgency and could wait until Michaelmas. He appeared at dinner every evening for a fortnight, which he had often taken in his study or at his club when in town, and he sat across from Rosalind and made conversation about the estate, the tenants, the weather, the progress of the South Meadow drainage, subjects he had previously considered beneath his attention and now pursued with the desperate thoroughness of a man who has discovered that everything beneath his attention was, in fact, everything. He asked Firth, with a casualness that fooled no one, whether the Duchess had mentioned anything about the lower pasture extension, and when Firth said she had proposed redirecting the drainage to follow the natural gradient rather than cutting across it, which would save £30 in labor, Alaric approved the expense without reviewing the estimate. "Her Grace has sound judgment in these matters," Firth said carefully. "Her Grace has sound judgment in all matters," Alaric replied. And Firth, who had served the Staveley family for 19 years and had learned that the most important conversations in a great house were the ones conducted in the margins of other conversations, understood that he was being told something and bowed his head. At the Midsummer Assembly in the county town, held in rooms lit by 300 candles and attended by every family of consequence within 20 miles, Alaric danced the first 2 dances with Rosalind. This was noted. He had not danced with her at a public assembly since their first year of marriage. She wore a gown of ivory silk with a high empire waist and seed pearls at the neckline, not new, but beautifully maintained, and she danced with the same composed precision she brought to everything, her hand light in his, her expression pleasant, her eyes meeting his and then moving away with a steadiness that offered neither encouragement nor refusal. Lady Greenlaw, who missed nothing that happened within 40 miles of her drawing-room, remarked to Mrs. Ashby that the Duke of Kelham appeared to have remembered he had a wife. This was overheard by Philippa Deverell, visiting from Dorset, who repeated it to Rosalind the following morning with the particular delight of a younger sister who has always suspected her elder sister's worth would eventually be recognized. Rosalind smiled and changed the subject to the christening. He wrote to Joanna. The letter was brief, 4 lines, and he showed it to no one, but its contents could be inferred from the fact that Lady Fanshawe was seen the following month at a house party in Surrey on the arm of Lord Dalrymple, looking entirely recovered from whatever attachment she had previously maintained. Rosalind heard about this through Philippa's correspondence and said nothing. She folded the letter and placed it with the family correspondence and did not return to it. The formal silver was cleaned and put back in the plate room. Mrs. Yarrow oversaw this personally, polishing each piece with a cloth before wrapping it in the baize and returning it to the velvet-lined case. She did not delegate this task. There are some objects in a household whose handling carries a significance beyond their material worth, and Mrs. Yarrow understood, without it ever being spoken, that the Rundle silver had become one of them. It was August when Alaric came to her in the garden. Not the formal garden that visitors admired, with its gravel walks and clipped yew hedges and the ornamental pond where the swans nested each spring, but the cutting garden behind the south wall, where Rosalind grew the roses and sweet peas and stocks she used for the house arrangements. She was speaking with the head gardener about the autumn planting, whether to extend the sweet pea rose or try the new variety of lavender that had arrived from a nursery in Hampshire, when she heard his step on the gravel path, and she turned with the expression she always wore when he appeared unexpectedly, attentive, civil, the face of a woman who had learned to expect nothing and was never surprised. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a question, but it was not a command. It occupied a territory between the two that she had not heard from him before. They walked along the south wall in the late afternoon. The espaliered pears were heavy with fruit that would not be ready until September. The brick was warm under the slanting light. A thrush was singing somewhere in the kitchen garden, repeating the same 3 notes with the patient insistence of a creature that has nothing to prove and all evening to prove it. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the morning room desk." She looked at him. "You write your letters there every morning. You have done since the first week you came to Kelham. I have walked past that room 1,000 times, and I could not have told you until this summer what you wrote or to whom or why." She said nothing. She waited. She had learned, in 3 years of marriage, that the most useful thing a woman could do with a silence was to let a man fill it himself. "I have been a poor student of this house," he said, "and a poorer one of you. You have been exactly what you intended to be, Your Grace. Yes, that is the problem I am describing." They walked a little further. A gardener's boy passed them with a wheelbarrow of cuttings and touched his cap. The gravel crunched beneath their feet. Rosalind's hands were clasped before her, not tightly, not in distress, but in the posture of a woman who has learned to hold herself together so well that the holding itself has become invisible. "I will not make speeches," Alaric said. "I do not think you want them." "No. I think you want me to be different, not to say I will be different, to be it." She looked at him then, fully, directly, with the unguarded expression he had glimpsed once, 3 years ago, across a dinner table at the Countess of Bridewell's, and had spent the years since failing to earn again. Her eyes were the color of strong tea held up to the light, and they held in them something that was not forgiveness, not yet, but the willingness to watch him try. "Yes," she said, "that is what I want." He nodded. There was nothing else to say, and they both understood that the saying was not the thing that mattered. They walked back toward the house in a silence that was different from the one at the breakfast table, not architectural, not load-bearing, but open, provisional. The kind of silence that exists between two people who have agreed to begin again and have not yet discovered whether they can. He held the garden door for her. His hand brushed her sleeve as she passed through. She did not pull away. The autumn brought changes that accrued like interest on a quietly invested sum. Alaric accompanied Rosalind to London for the opening of the parliamentary session, and sat with her in the gallery of the House of Lords while the speeches were read. She had never been invited before. He consulted her on a matter of tenant housing, 3 cottages on the east boundary requiring new roofs, and when she proposed an alteration to the design that improved ventilation without increasing cost, he implemented it without amendment and told Firth to credit the Duchess in the estate ledger. At Christmas, for the first time, they hosted the Deverell family at Kelham Park. Sir Halbert arrived with Rosalind's mother and all 3 sisters, and he stood in the great hall beneath the portraits of 5 generations of Staveleys and looked at what his eldest daughter had made of the house, the beeswax-scented rooms, the fires that drew perfectly, the holly arrangements on every mantelpiece, the kitchen that produced a Christmas dinner for 38 without a single dish arriving cold. And he said to Alaric, with the careful diplomacy of a man who has understood more than he was ever told, "She has done remarkably well." Alaric replied, "She has done better than anyone in this house deserved." And Sir Halbert regarded him for a moment with an expression that was not quite forgiveness, but was perhaps its antechamber, and then accepted a glass of claret and said no more about it. By spring, the space between them had narrowed to something that was no longer distance but proximity. The tentative, deliberate proximity of 2 people learning to occupy the same rooms, not as the Duke and Duchess of Kelham, performing their separate duties under a shared roof, but as Alaric and Rosalind, who had hurt each other in different ways and were choosing, day by day, not to look away from it. She began leaving the morning room door open when she wrote her letters, and he began pausing there on his way to the study, not entering, not interrupting, but standing for a moment in the doorway with his coffee and watching the light fall across her desk, learning the shape of her mornings the way he should have done from the beginning. Their son was born the following winter, on a night of hard frost when the windows of Kellam Park were white with ice, and Mrs. Yarrow kept the fires built so high that the servants complained of the heat 3 rooms away. He was small, furious, and perfect. Rosalind held him against her chest and looked at Alaric, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with an expression she had never seen on him, undefended, stripped of every competence he had ever used as armor, and she said, "He has your hands." "God help him," Alaric said, and she laughed, and the sound of it, startled, unguarded, real, filled the room in a way that 300 candles could not have matched. They named him Edward Halbert, for Alaric's father and Rosalind's. Years later, years measured in harvests and assemblies, and the slow growth of a boy who had his father's hands and his mother's talent for sitting quietly in a room and understanding everything that happened in it, Mrs. Yarrow told the story to a new housemaid. The girl had asked, in the idle way of young staff who sense that a house contains more history than its walls suggest, whether the Duke and Duchess had always been as they were now. Mrs. Yarrow considered the question. She was in the still room, labeling the summer preserves, and she did not look up from her work. "There was a morning," she said, "early in the marriage. The Duchess ordered a breakfast tray prepared for a guest in the blue room, formal silver, chocolate, coddled eggs, a white rose from the garden. The housemaid waited. The guest departed before 9. The tray came back untouched, the chocolate cold, the eggs solid in the dish. The Duchess never mentioned it. His Grace never mentioned it. And the blue guest chamber was never opened for that particular visitor again." She set down her pen and looked at the housemaid with the expression of a woman who has kept a household secrets for 30 years and intends to keep them for 30 more. That is all I shall say on the matter. The housemaid, who was young but not stupid, understood that she had been told everything. In the drawing room above, Rosalind sat at the window with her embroidery frame, though she was not embroidering. She was watching Edward chase the spaniel across the south lawn, his coat already grass-stained at the elbows, though it was not yet noon. Alaric was in his study, visible through the open door that now stood permanently ajar, reviewing something with Firth. She could hear the low murmur of their voices, the occasional scratch of a pen, the particular cadence her husband used when he was agreeing to an expenditure he had not fully examined because his steward had told him the Duchess approved it. The house was filled with the particular warmth of a Tuesday in late spring when nothing of consequence was happening, and everything of consequence had already happened, long ago, on a morning that smelled of chocolate and white roses and the beeswax scent of a household tended, thoroughly and without interruption, by a woman who understood that the most powerful thing she could do with her anger was to fold it into an act of service so perfect that it would never need to be mentioned again. She had never told him about the note. He had never asked. Some things between a husband and wife are better left in the precise crease of their folding, known, understood, and never opened again. They arrive here, like a tray set with unexpected care, whenever they are ready.